So my name's Joe Kendrick. I'm a research and policy analyst here at the Blue-Green Alliance, and I'm going to give you a brief overview of how the BABA law works and what it means specifically for US manufacturers. Everything I'm going to be talking about today is covered in more detail in our recently released user guide, Making BABA Work for American Manufacturers. Next slide, please. So the first question you might be asking is why American manufacturers should even care about BABA. As Jason mentioned, there have been Buy America policies and Buy America preferences in law before, but BABA has really dramatically expanded the scope and scale of these, both in terms of the types of projects that are covered by a Buy America preference and the types of products that are covered by these Buy America preferences. BABA was signed into law as part of the as part of the bipartisan infrastructure law, which was closely followed by the Inflation Reduction Act. And these two policies together invested over $700 billion in spending that is covered by BABA. And this money, in the majority of it, has been awarded and obligated to different developers of infrastructure projects and will be spent over the next several years, meaning that those developers will be looking for BABA compliant products as they build out their projects. BABA doesn't just apply to Bill and IRA, however. It's an indefinite permanent law that's going to apply to all infrastructure spending moving forward, approximately $100 billion a year. So this is a lot of money. Next slide, please. So what does the law say exactly? The key sentence is that each federal agency shall ensure that none of the funds made available for a federal financial assistance program for infrastructure may be obligated for a project unless all of the iron, steel, manufactured products, and construction materials used in the project are produced in the United States. So, in short, federally subsidized infrastructure projects need to use American-made materials and products. The exact contours of what is and isn't covered, however, depends on how these key terms are defined, both in law, by the Office of Management and Budget, and by the federal agencies who are implementing this law. Next slide, please. So in terms of the projects that are covered, BABA says that federal financial assistance for infrastructure is what's at stake here. Federal financial assistance means that the federal government is giving money to a different entity as opposed to spending it directly itself. And the recipient entity in this case could be a state government, a local government, or a nonprofit organization like a university, a school system, or a hospital. Infrastructure is defined very broadly by BABA. It includes what you might sort of conventionally think of as infrastructure, transportation projects like roads, bridges, and public transit, but also things like ports, airports, water infrastructure, all sorts of electricity generation, transmission, and distribution. EV charging is specifically called out. Utilities and broadband are covered. All sorts of different buildings are covered with the exception of private homes. And then in addition to all of these different categories of infrastructure, anything that is publicly owned, publicly operated, or serves a public function can be categorized as infrastructure as well. So this is really a very broad definition, and it means a lot of different construction projects are going to be covered by BABA. Next slide, please. Next question you probably have is what types of products are covered. So the law mentions iron and steel, construction materials, and manufactured products. Each of these has its own specific definition and its own requirements for how a product or material is defined as being produced in the US and thus complying with the law. Next slide, please. So iron and steel in BABA refers both to simple, pure iron and steel products like I-beams or rebar, but also more complicated products that are predominantly made from iron and steel, like a hydrant or a metal door. To qualify as produced in the United States, all manufacturing processes for the metal, from the initial pouring and melting through the final assembly of the product, must take place domestically. The only exception to this is that in most cases, minor components of iron and steel products can be excluded. So if your company makes, say, a steel frame that's made from domestic steel, but the bolts holding the frame together are imported, that will likely still qualify as made in the US under BABA. Next slide, please. Construction materials is a broader category that encompasses a bunch of different materials, everything from non-ferrous metals like aluminum, plastics and polymers, glass, lumber, engineered wood, drywall, coatings, fiber optics, bricks, and various composites. The one thing you'll notice is not on this list is concrete, cement, and other aggregates. These are specifically excluded. And for construction materials, again, all manufacturing processes must take place in the United States. Next slide, please. Manufactured products is probably the broadest and the most complicated category that's included in BABA. A manufactured product is basically anything that's made of multiple materials combined together into something new. So glass is considered a construction material. Lumber is considered a construction material. But if you make a glass window and you put a wood frame around it, that becomes a manufactured product, and it has a different set of requirements. Manufactured products are covered by BABA only when they are permanently affixed to an infrastructure project. So if you imagine an infrastructure project to construct a new local government office building that receives federal funds, the construction materials, iron and steel, are certainly covered. The manufactured products are covered when they're permanently affixed. So things like the windows and the doors of the building, any permanently installed computer, server, or electronic equipment, the HVAC system, the plumbing, things like that would be covered. However, the contents and furnishings of the building won't be covered if they're not permanently affixed. So things like tables, chairs, and the personal portable computer equipment of the workers don't have to comply with BABA. And then to be categorized as made in the US, manufactured products both need to be domestically assembled, and 55% of the total cost for their components has to be from US made components. Next slide, please. So that 55% threshold is key, and this is a table taken from the manufacturer guide that we published, showing a very oversimplified theoretical cost breakdown of a hypothetical HVAC product. And what you'll see here is that in this hypothetical example, the total cost of the domestically purchased and the made in-house components of the product represents 60% of the total cost of all components, including imported components and their shipping and import duties. So this hypothetical product would meet that 55% threshold, and assuming that it was domestically assembled, it would count as made in the US for the purpose of BABA. Next slide, please. So if your company makes products or materials that meet these requirements and comply with BABA, how do you make sure that they get certified as such? The answer is that you need to go through a process of self-certification. And this means that you need to produce documentation, usually just in the form of a simple letter or PDF, that states that the product or material complies. The self-certification document is pretty simple. It just needs to list the manufacturing location, and in the case of a manufactured product, you should indicate that it meets this 55% threshold. But it doesn't need a detailed cost breakdown or any specific information on where different components are sourced from. The self-certification documentation needs to be unique to each project that's using your products. So it's not enough to just post a to whom it may concern letter on your website for anyone to download. You're going to need to put the specific project name for each project that uses your products, sign the letter, and send that along to the project developer. So if you make products that comply with BABA and are used in infrastructure projects, you can proactively list and advertise those, and we'll get into some more details later on how you might do that. But you should also be ready to issue this documentation to developers as they request it. Next slide, please. Here's just an example of what that self-certification letter might look like. This is taken from FEMA's BABA documentation, and as you see, it's pretty short and simple and just requires you to fill in your company information, the project information, the information about the products being supplied, the manufacturing location of final assembly, and a signature. Next slide, please. The other thing you should know about with regard to BABA is waivers. So when BABA was written, it was understood that not every single product, that every single infrastructure project is going to need, is going to be available domestically. So if a project developer can't find a suitable domestic product, or if using domestic products raises their project's cost by more than 25%, they can request a waiver of BABA. Some number of waivers being requested and approved is to be expected. It doesn't indicate that the law is failing or isn't being followed. What we would like to see is that the waivers be product specific and time limited so that they provide a clear market signal that something is in demand but isn't being made here, and that if a domestic company could start making it, they would get that business. So when a developer requests a waiver, it'll be posted online for comment for 15 days. All waivers will be posted on the websites of the agencies handling the projects, and there's a central directory for waivers available at the madeinamerica.gov website. As a manufacturer, you can keep your eye on these waivers, and if you see a new one get posted, you can treat it a bit like a request for proposal. If you make a product that you think satisfies the need of the project, you can respond directly during the comment period and possibly sell your product to that developer. You can also look at waivers that have already been accepted. And if you see that certain types of products are getting a lot of waivers for them, that's a signal that there is a lot of unmet demand for a domestic version of that product. So if it's something similar to what you already make, or maybe something you've made in the past, that's a signal to you that perhaps you would have a ready customer base if you were to start manufacturing a BABA compliant version of that product. Next slide, please. The final thing that I want to touch on is how BABA compares to prior domestic preference policy. So there are two major categories of prior domestic preference policy, and they are confusingly titled Buy America and Buy American. Buy America, it represents a number of different policies that are very similar to BABA and in many cases have been superseded by BABA, but were historically narrower in scope. So they would cover things like iron and steel products for water infrastructure funded by the EPA, or rail cars and other transit equipment on certain federally funded transportation projects. Buy American refers specifically to the Buy American Act, which applies to direct federal procurement. So that's the federal government spending money on stuff for its own use, as opposed to BABA, which covers federal financial assistance, where the federal government is giving money to another entity for infrastructure development. And there's a critical difference between BABA and the Buy American Act that you should be aware of in case you're familiar with the Buy American Act. That's that the Buy American Act allows the use of foreign products from US trading partners, whereas BABA does not. Because of this difference, agencies have indicated that they won't accept Buy American Act compliance documentation as compliance documentation for BABA. So if your company makes products that are compliant with the Buy American Act and you have a label or a certification of this, you're still going to need to evaluate whether you meet the requirements of BABA specifically and issue this self-certification documentation that references BABA rather than Buy American. That's all the information I have for you today. If you want more detail on any of this, you can look at our published user guide, which goes into a lot more detail, or feel free to ask questions during the Q&A portion at the end of this call.